Hi, Kevin Wright here, back with another property finance video. And this week we're talking about are protected tenants a no-go area? Stick around and we'll drill down and see if they are or not. Now, there are certain tenants that are known by different names. Protected tenants is one, sit-in tenants is another, but they're actually more correctly called regulated tenants. And who are these tenants and where do they come from? So regulated tenants, to use the correct term, have a tenancy agreement predate ASTs, which is the residential tenancy agreement that everybody uses nowadays, landlords and tenants. And these regulated tenancy agreements give them a bunch of right that ordinary tenants on ASTs don't have. Now, I'm going to pick up on the term sit-in tenant because I see this misused, probably innocently, by a lot of sources and other people trying to sell a property with a tenant in situ. Now, tenant in situ is probably a more accurate description. So when someone is selling a property, whether it's a sourcer or whether it's a landlord selling their property and they're selling it with a tenant, they often say it's got a sit-in tenant. But historically, sit-in tenant is a phrase that has been used in previous decades to describe these regulated tenants. Just calling someone living in a property a sit-in tenant could give a level of ambiguity which you'd need to drill down on. It could just be a tenant in situ, ordinary tenant on an AST, which causes no problems. Now, back to regulated tenants then. ASTs came into existence on the 1st of January 1989. And since then, for 30 plus years, every residential tenant has had a tenancy agreement of the short hold nature, so AST, with a 6 or 12 month duration, and then the option to go into a rolling tenancy after that. Now, I was renting properties before ASTs existed, and we had to rent to regulated tenants. So for the decades before the 1st of January 1989, regulated tenancies were the dominant, in fact the only tenancy agreement, like ASTs are the only tenancy agreement now. So what is different about a regulated tenant? Well, that agreement gives them way more rights to occupy a property than is permissible under an AST. One of the biggest differences is that a regulated tenant has not 6 months, not 12 months, but a lifetime's right to occupy a property. Now, as long as they keep the rent up to date. So where you can issue an AST tenant with a Section 8, Section 21, and give them notice to evict them, you cannot give notice to a regulated tenant to evict them. They have the opportunity to live in that property for life. Also, their rent is controlled. What does that mean? It means you as a landlord cannot just decide, I'm going to put your rent up. You have to make an application to a rental tribunal, and yes, there is a rental tribunal, and they sit in judgment of applications from a landlord to increase the rent of a regulated tenant. Now, once you make your application for a rent increase, the tribunal contacts the tenant and says, hey, what do you think about this rent increase that's proposed? I guess you wouldn't be too surprised to learn that the tenants usually oppose it. What do you mean you're not subscribed? Weekly finance videos? Weekly Monday morning Q&As? Mentee case studies? What's not to like? Come on, click that button. And that dingy belly thing. And the Instagram one too. That's better. Now back to the video. So the rent tribunal decides if you, the landlord, can increase the rent and how much they will limit that rent increase to. Hey, and there's one other thing. You know, I said that they've got the lifetime's right to occupy this property. When they pass away, if they've had an adult child living with them for the 2 years prior to their death, that lifetime's tenancy passes on to the child. So now their adult child can live there for the rest of their life. Now you may be thinking, what a bum deal. Who would want to have been a landlord back in the 80s, 70s, 60s and before that? And the answer is, well, not many. So the private rental sector was dying on its feet. Worse than that, landlords, I guess with some justification, would say, I'm not spending any money on my property to improve it if I can't put the rent up. So it meant that there were many, many tenants that were living in really poor conditions. And ASTs were brought in to redress the balance. Now, whether you think that ASTs have swung the pendulum too far and the landlord has too many rights and the tenant has too few, it was certainly the case before then that the tenants had too many rights and the landlords had too few. And I guess the trick is always when you're swinging the pendulum to get it to stop in the right place. Now, I'm not going to pass judgment on where we are now, whether that's the right place or not. That's not the purpose of this video. So 30 years or more of controlled rent with the rent tribunal. And by the way, once you've had a rent increase or once you've applied, you can only go back 2 years later. Every 2 years you can apply for a rent increase. So 30 plus years of controlled rents means that these regulated tenants are probably paying less than 50 and probably closer to 25% of the market rent now in 2022 of the current market rent, so they're living very cheaply by comparison. Now you might think this doesn't sound such a great deal, and in almost all cases for almost all investors you'd be absolutely right. Now it's a fact that mortgage lenders will not touch a regulated tenancy property with a barge pole. Why? Simply because they cannot, if they have to repossess them, repossess the landlord, that is, not the tenant, if they have to repossess the property, unlike an AST where they can just evict the tenant, they cannot evict the regulated tenant. So if they can't evict the regulated tenant, they cannot put it back on the open market to sell with vacant possession to get back their capital, so they're out in a big way. Regulated tenant properties are a big cash buyer only proposition. So if you have to pay cash for them and you can't put a mortgage on them, who buys them? Well, there's a type of person that laps up regulated tenancies. They're not worried about the lifetime right to occupy. They're not worried about the controlled rent, because for them it's bought as a legacy product for their children or possibly even their grandchildren. Who are these people then? Affluent families or individuals. Now they've got plenty of spare cash and they see these regulated tenancies as a good investment on a legacy basis. Now with these, because of all those restrictions and because of their undesirability, you'd rarely pay more than 50% of the current market value to buy one of these properties. So if you've got a pile of cash sitting in the bank earning very little and you can put it into one of these properties instead, take the reduced rent and wait for as long as it takes. With the eventual demise of the tenant, you're looking at least 100% uplift in your investment when it reverts to full market value. But in those intervening years, they've got the capital growth, which will be more or less depending on whereabouts in the country it is. So you could be looking at a 400, 500, 600% return on their money. So you've got to decide which camp you sit in. If you're not in the wealthy, affluent category, you're in the need a mortgage, recycle your cash category. And if that's the case, regulated tenants are an absolute no-go. So that's this week's history lesson done with. I'm going to be back with another property finance video and I'll see you guys next week. If you enjoyed watching this video, did you know every Monday morning at 8:30 I do a live Facebook Q&A. So if you want to start the week with checking out some answers to your property finance questions, click the link here.